The rain in Hampstead always felt like a secret kept between the grey sky and the moss-covered stones of Church Row. It was a rhythmic, insistent drumming that afternoon, blurring the edges of the world until the Victorian townhouses seemed to dissolve into inkwashes of charcoal and slate. Inside the library of number 14, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax, old paper, and the faint, sharp tang of Alistair Thorne's bergamot tea. Elara Vance sat by the window, her knees drawn to her chest, a heavy volume of Keats resting precariously on her lap. She wasn't reading. Instead, she was watching the way the condensation crawled down the glass, tiny rivulets forging paths like veins across a cold cheek. She felt the weight of the house around her, a grand, silent beast of mahogany and velvet-tanned. More specifically, she felt the weight of the man sitting behind the oak desk across the room. Alistair hadn't spoken for nearly an hour. The only sound he contributed to the room was the occasional, deliberate scratch of a fountain pen against parchment. He was a man of gravity, a pillar of quietude that seemed to pull the very oxygen toward him. At 45, he possessed a stillness that Elara, at 22, found both terrifying and profoundly magnetic. It was a stillness born not of peace, but of a meticulously governed interior world. She shifted slightly, the silk of her skirt whispering against the leather chair. Immediately, the scratching of the pen stopped. "You're restless, Elara," he said. His voice was a low cello note, vibrating in the space between them without breaking the silence so much as deepening it. "I didn't think you were looking," she replied, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. "I don't need to look to know your geometry," Alistair said. He didn't turn his head. He remained focused on the ledger before him, his profile silhouetted against the dim amber glow of a desk lamp. "The way you hold your breath when you're thinking too much, the way you tap your thumb against the spine of that book, you are a cacophony of small movements." Elara felt a flush creep up her neck, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. This was the boundary they lived within, a perimeter he had drawn with invisible ink the day she had moved into the house following her father's death. He was her guardian, her benefactor, her uncle by title if not by blood, yet the word felt like a lie in her mouth. It was too domestic, too safe for the electric tension that thrummed whenever he entered a room. He rose then, his movements fluid and economical. Alistair was a tall man, his presence occupying the height of the room with an effortless authority. He walked toward her, the floorboards offering no protest beneath his polished brogues. When he stopped beside her chair, he didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from him was a physical pressure. "The rain is bothering you," he observed, looking out at the drowned garden. "It feels like we're trapped," she whispered. "Trapped," he repeated the word as if tasting it, or protected. "The world outside is a chaotic, messy thing, Elara. Here, there is order. There is safety. There is me." She looked up at him, braving the intensity of his gaze. His eyes were the color of a winter sea gray, flecked with flint, and utterly unreadable. There was a possessiveness in the way he looked at her, not the crude ownership of an object, but the fierce, obsessive stewardship of a master over a masterpiece. He didn't just want her to be safe, he wanted to be the very air she breathed, the filter through which she perceived existence. "Is there a difference?" she asked, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, between being protected and being a prisoner? Alistair reached down, his fingers hovering just inches from her temple before he tucked a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. The contact was brief, a mere ghost of a touch, yet it felt like a brand. His skin was warm, his touch remarkably gentle for a man who commanded so much power in the city's boardrooms. "A prisoner longs for the door to be unlocked," he murmured, leaning closer until she could smell the faint spice of his cologne sandalwood and something darker, like crushed earth. "You have the key to every door in this house, Elara, yet you stay. Why is that?" She couldn't answer, To answer would be to admit to the vertigo she felt whenever he looked at her, the terrifying, delicious sensation of falling into a void where only his hand could catch her. She stayed because the world outside felt thin and pale compared to the monochromatic intensity of Alistair Thorne. He was her sun, a dark star around which her entire life now orbited. I stay because I don't know who I am outside these walls anymore, she confessed, her voice barely audible over the rain. You are exactly who I intend you to be, he said, and the sheer arrogance of the statement should have repulsed her. Instead, it acted as a bomb to her uncertainty. To be intended by someone like Alistair was to have a purpose, to be sculpted by a hand that knew exactly where the marble ended and the soul began. He moved to the small sideboard, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. The clinking of the glass was sharp, definitive. He didn't offer her any. He treated her youth as a fragile thing to be preserved, a vintage that hadn't yet reached its peak. I saw the sketches you left in the morning room, he said, his back to her, the ones of the Merlands. Elara stiffened. Her drawings were the only part of her he hadn't yet curated. They're just exercises, shadows and light. They are lonely, Alistair corrected, turning back to face her. There is a vastness in them that suggests a desire to wander. Do you find my company so claustrophobic? No, she said, perhaps too quickly. It's not that, it's just, sometimes I wonder if I'm disappearing. Into the curtains, into the books, into you. Alistair set his glass down. The movement was slow, deliberate. He walked back to her, and this time he didn't stop at the edge of her chair. He knelt before her, a gesture of supplication that felt more like a conquest. He took her hands in his large palm swallowing hers whole. Her fingers looked porcelain white against his tanned skin. You aren't disappearing. Elara, you are being refined. The world would use you up in a week. It would take your light and scatter it until there was nothing left but ash. I am keeping the wind away. Is that so terrible? The wind is how things grow, Alistair. Trees need the wind to strengthen their roots. And flowers, he counted, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her wrist right over the pulsing vein. Flowers are crushed by the wind. They are torn from their stems. I prefer you in the hothouse, where the temperature is constant and the glass is thick. The metaphor was a cage, gilded and beautiful, but a cage nonetheless. She looked down at their joined hands. He held her with a grip that was firm but not painful, a physical manifestation of his psychological hold. It was a boundary she crossed every day, the line between gratitude and a deeper, more dangerous surrender. You're trembling, he noted. His voice had softened, losing its architectural edge, becoming something more intimate, more predatory in its tenderness. I'm cold, she lied. He rose, pulling her up with him. He didn't let go of her hands. He drew her into the circle of his space, the distance between them vanishing until she had to tilt her head back to see him. In the dim light of the library, he looked like a figure from an old Dutch painting, all sharp angles and deep shadows, a man who had mastered the art of holding back the tide. I will build a bigger fire, he said, his breath brushing her forehead. I will buy you silks that hold the heat. I will give you everything, Elara, every book, every jewel, every thought in my head, but you must understand the price. And what is the price? She asked, though she already knew. The price is the world, Alistair whispered. You give up the noise, the clutter, the people who do not matter. You give up the right to be lost, because as long as you are here, I will always know exactly where you are. I will always be the one to find you. It was a sweet possession, a slow-acting poison that tasted of honey and ancient dust. She felt the walls of the library closing in, not as stone and mortar, but as an embrace. She thought of the rain outside, the cold, wet streets of London where people hurried along, shivering and alone. Then she looked at the fire and at the man who stood like a sentinel between her and the dark. I don't want to be found by anyone else, she admitted. The words felt like a betrayal of her own soul. yet they were the truest things she had ever spoken. Alistair's expression didn't change, but his eyes flared with a sudden, triumphant light. He reached out and cupped her face, his fingers splayed across her jaw. It was a gesture of absolute lordship. "Good," he said, "then the boundary is set." He leaned down, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. The air between them was charged, a static hum that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up, but he didn't. He merely pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of profound, suffocating intimacy. "Now," he said, his voice returning to its cool, authoritative tone, "read to me, not Keats, something with more structure, something that reminds us why we stay inside." He released her and returned to his chair, the master of the house once more. Elara stood by the window for a long moment, watching the rain continue its assault on the glass. She felt the key in her pocket, the key he said she had. She knew, with a sinking, soaring certainty, that she would never use it. The boundary was too sweet, the cage too warm, and the man who held the bars was the only world she had left. She picked up a volume of Milton and began to read, her voice steadying as Alistair leaned back, his eyes closed, listening to the sound of his most prized possession. The rain outside continued to fall, but inside, the fire was high and the door was firmly shut. The evening deepened, the amber glow of the library shrinking as the shadows in the corners grew long and spindly. Alistair remained in his chair, a silent judge of the cadence of her voice. Elara read until her throat felt dry, until the words on the page began to swim and merge into a singular narrative of loss and redemption. Every time she paused to turn a page, she could feel his attention, a physical weight that never wavered. It was as if he were memorizing the very frequency of her breath. She wondered if this was what it felt like to be a bird in a curated aviary fed the finest grain, protected from the hawk, but forever denied the terrifying expanse of the horizon. "That's enough, Elara," he said eventually. The fire had burned down to a heap of glowing embers, casting a hellish, beautiful light across his features. She closed the book, the thud of the cover echoing in the stillness. "What happens now?" she asked. It was a question for the night, for their lives, for the strange, unspoken contract they had signed in the silence. Alistair stood and walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was inches away, his presence eclipsing the rest of the room. He reached out and took the book from her hands, placing it on a nearby table without taking his eyes off her. "Now," he said, his voice dropping to a register that made her heart skip, "we enjoy the silence we've built. The world is asleep. Elara, there is no one left but us." He took her hand and led her toward the door. As they stepped out into the hallway, the grand staircase loomed ahead, a spine of dark wood winding upward into the gloom. He didn't let go of her. He led her up the stairs, his grip firm, a silent reminder of the boundary that kept her safe and kept her his. The house seemed to breathe with them, a rhythmic expansion and contraction of floorboards and rafters. In the darkness, the lines between guardian and ward, between care and obsession, blurred into a single, shimmering thread. Elara followed him, her feet silent on the plush carpet, moving deeper into the heart of the labyrinth he had constructed for her. Outside, the rain finally began to taper off, leaving the world dripping and cold. But inside number 14, the heat remained constant, a controlled environment where nothing was allowed to wither, and nothing was allowed to truly fly. It was a sweet possession, a boundary made of silk and iron, and as Alistair closed the door to the upper landing, Elara knew she had finally found the only home she was allowed to have. The silence that followed was absolute, the silence of a secret kept, of a treasure locked away, of a man who had finally claimed the only thing he had ever truly wanted to own. And in that silence, Elara Vance stopped looking for the wind. The dawn that followed was not a breaking of light, but a gradual thinning of the shadows that clung to the velvet hangings of her bedroom. Elara lay still, her breath hitching in the quiet air of number 14, Pembroke Crescent. The house felt like a bell jar, vacuum-sealed against the cacophony of London, protecting her from the soot-stained reality of the streets. She could hear the muffled chime of the grandfather clock in the hall a steady, rhythmic pulse that mirrored Alistair Thorne's own heartbeat. It was a sound that didn't just mark time, it governed it. She lay beneath the weight of the Egyptian cotton, her body tracing the cold geography of the bed she had occupied since Alistair had brought her here from the wreckage of her former life. She felt the silence of the house as a physical presence, a sentinel standing guard at the threshold of her consciousness. It was the silence of a gallery after hours, where every object, every vase, every painting, and every girl was precisely where it was meant to be, curated for a single pair of eyes. She rose with a mechanical grace, her movements dictated by the invisible lines Alistair had drawn across the floorboards. In the mirror, her reflection looked back at her like a stranger in a familiar dress. The silk slip she wore was a shade of cream that he had chosen, claiming it complemented the porcelain undertones of her skin. To Alistair, she was a canvas, and he was the only artist permitted to hold the brush. The thought should have provoked a rebellion, a sharp flare of indignation, but instead it settled in her chest like a sedative. To be seen so clearly, to be defined so absolutely, was a form of mercy she hadn't known she craved. When she descended the stairs, the scent of Earl Grey and toasted brioche rose to meet her, a domestic incense. Alistair was already seated at the head of the mahogany table, his attention focused on a leather-bound ledger. He didn't look up as she entered, yet she felt the shift in the air, the way his gravity pulled at her until she found her seat at his right hand. The morning light filtered through the thick London fog, and the heavy Victorian glass turned his hair to silver and deepened the hollows of his cheeks. "You slept late, Elara," he remarked, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very silver of the tea service. He didn't check his watch. He didn't need to. He was the clock by which the house operated. "The rain kept me awake for a while," she lied, her voice sounding thin and fragile in the vastness of the dining room. It was a small, useless lie, a tiny pebble thrown into a deep well. Alistair finally looked up. His eyes, the colour of a winter sea, searched her face with a clinical, terrifying tenderness. He reached across the table, his fingers grazing the pulse point at her wrist. It wasn't a caress, it was a measurement. He was checking the tempo of his possession, ensuring the internal machinery of his prize was functioning within the parameters he had set. "The rain is gone now," he said, his thumb tracing a slow, deliberate circle over her skin. "There is nothing left to disturb you. I have seen to it." He stood and walked around the table, his presence looming over her like a shadow that refused to dissipate with the sun. He leaned down, his hand coming to rest on the back of her chair, his breath warm against the shell of her ear. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them, the air thickening with the scent of old books and expensive tobacco. "I've decided on the itinerary for today," he whispered, the authority in his tone softened by a layer of possessive warmth. "We shall stay in the music room. I want to hear you play the Rachmaninoff. No distractions, no windows left unlatched, just the music, and the way you look when you lose yourself in it." He placed a hand on her shoulder, the weight of it both a tether and a shield. Elara looked down at her tea, watching the steam curl and vanish into the air. She thought of the key in her pocket, the cold metal against her thigh. It was a symbol of a choice she no longer felt capable of making. To use it would be to step back into the wind, to face the biting chill of a world that didn't know her name. Here, she was Elara Vance, the center of a carefully constructed universe. She was a secret kept behind iron gates and heavy doors, a treasure whose value was determined by the intensity of the man who held her. "Do you understand, Elara?" he asked, his grip tightening just enough to be felt, a silent reminder of the boundary he had set the night before. "Yes, Alistair," she murmured, her heart traitorously steady under his touch. "I understand." He smiled, a rare, fleeting expression that didn't reach his eyes but softened the hard lines of his jaw. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her temple, dry, lingering, and absolute. It was the seal on a contract she had never signed, but one she was increasingly unwilling to void. As he led her toward the music room, the hallway seemed to stretch, the walls closing in with a velvet intimacy. Every portrait on the wall, every bust of a long-dead philosopher, seemed to watch her with approval. She was part of the collection now, a living masterpiece in the Thorne estate. And as Alistair opened the double doors to the music room, revealing the grand piano that sat like a black altar in the center of the light, Elara felt a strange, terrifying peace. The wind was gone, the doors were locked, and the master of the house was watching. It was a sweet, stifling cage, and she was beginning to love the bars. The doors clicked shut behind them, a final, definitive percussion that echoed through the vaulted silence of the music room. It was a space of curated echoes, where the very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the vibration of a string or the strike of a hammer. Sunlight, thin and pale as watered milk, spilled through the tall sash windows, illuminating the dancing motes of dust that drifted like tiny, aimless souls in the stillness. Elara crossed the expanse of the parquet floor, her footsteps muffled by a Persian rug that felt like moss beneath her slippers. The piano, a magnificent, brooding beast of polished ebony, sat in the center of the room, its lid propped open like the wing of a great bird frozen in mid-flight. She felt the weight of the key in her pocket, a jagged piece of cold iron that seemed to pulse against her hip with every step. It was a fragment of another world, a jagged reminder of the wine-swept streets and the chaotic, indifferent noise of London that lay beyond the high stone walls of the Thorne estate. "The stool, Elara," Alistair said, his voice a soft command that didn't need to be raised. He didn't follow her to the instrument. Instead, he retreated to a wingback chair in the corner, a throne of tufted leather that placed him in the shadows, where he could observe without being observed. She sat, the wood of the stool cool through her skirts. She didn't look at him, but she could feel him, a heavy, gravitational presence that anchored her to the spot. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. The Rachmaninoff was a mountain of a piece, a turbulent sea of minor chords and frantic, cascading scales that required a strength she wasn't sure she possessed this morning. As she struck the first chord, the sound tore through the room, a deep, resonant bell that vibrated in her chest. She began to play, and with every note, the room seemed to shrink. The walls, lined with shelves of leather-bound scores and heavy velvet drapes, drew closer. The music was no longer an escape, it was a dialogue between her and the man in the shadows. Each crescendo was a plea, each decrescendo a surrender. Her mind, however, refused to stay within the confines of the melody. It drifted to the garden gate, to the way the latch had felt under her thumb the night before. She thought of the freedom that lay just a few hundred yards away, the anonymity of a crowded bus, the salt spray of the Thames, the terrifying, beautiful uncertainty of a life where no one knew the exact rhythm of her heart. But then she felt Alistair's gaze. It was a physical thing, a warmth that settled on the nape of her neck, a tether that pulled her back from the precipice of her own thoughts. He wasn't just listening to the music, he was listening to her. He was deciphering the hesitation in her left hand, the slight rush in the tempo that betrayed her anxiety. He knew the shape of her fear as intimately as he knew the curve of her spine. The piece reached its climax, a thunderous outpouring of grief and beauty that left her breathless, her fingers aching against the ivory. As the final note faded into the velvet silence, she kept her head bowed, her hair falling forward to shroud her face. The silence that followed was more oppressive than the music had been. It was the silence of a predator watching its prey, a silence thick with the unspoken terms of their arrangement. "You missed the nuance in the third movement," Alistair said eventually. The sound of his voice, calm and clinical, was like a splash of cold water. "You were thinking of the world outside again, weren't you?" Elara stiffened, her fingers curling into claws atop the keys. "I was focusing on the technique." "Lies are beneath you, Elara," he replied, the creak of the leather chair signaling his movement. He walked toward her, his footsteps measured and deliberate. He stopped behind her, his presence a wall of heat. "You were thinking of the gate. You were thinking of the key. You were wondering if the lock is as rusted as it looks." A cold shiver raced down her spine. How could he know? Had he seen her in the library? Had he left the key there as a test, a bauble to see if she would succumb to the temptation of a door she had no right to open? He reached over her shoulder, his large, calloused hand covering hers on the keys. He pressed down, forcing a dissonant, jarring chord to ring out. The sound was a violation of the beauty she had just created, a reminder of who truly held the power in this room. "Freedom is a misunderstood concept," he whispered, his breath stirring the fine hairs at her temple. "The world you crave is a place of hunger and indifference. It would swallow you whole and never remember your name. Here, you are cherished. Here. Every breath you take is a masterpiece. Why would you trade the devotion of a god for the neglect of a crowd?" Elara looked down at their joined hands, the pale, delicate ivory of her skin against the weathered, powerful bronze of his. It was a study in contrasts, a visual representation of their entire existence. He was the cage, yes, but he was also the only person who had ever truly seen her. In the outside world, she was a ghost, a girl lost in the grey margins of society. Here, under the suffocating intensity of his obsession, she was vital. She was the sun around which his entire dark world orbited. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered, though the protest felt hollow, even to her own ears. "We rarely ask for the things we need most," Alistair replied. He leaned down, his chin resting on her shoulder, his eyes fixed on their reflection in the polished wood of the piano. "You are the melody that justifies the silence of this house. Without you, these rooms are just hollow boxes of stone and dust. I will not let the world mute you. Elara, I will protect your song, even if I have to break the instrument to do it." He moved his hand from hers to her throat, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a terrifying, reverent slowness. It wasn't a threat of violence, but something far more potent, the threat of total, absolute absorption. He wanted to breathe her air, to think her thoughts, to be the very blood that moved through her veins. Elara closed her eyes, her head falling back against his chest. The key in her pocket felt heavier than ever, a leaden weight that threatened to pull her down into the depths of the floor. She realized, with a sickening jolt of clarity, that she wasn't afraid of him locking the door. She was afraid that, eventually, she would stop wanting to open it. "Play it again," he commanded, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. "From the beginning. And this time, Elara, play it as if there is no garden. Play it as if this room is the only world that has ever existed." She reached for the keys again, her movements fluid and mechanical. The first chord ran out, deeper and more resonant than before. As the music began to swell, filling the spaces between them, the boundaries of her identity seemed to blur. She was no longer Elara Vance, the girl who dreamed of escape. She was a resonance, a vibration, a creature of silk and ivory held fast in the palm of a man who would never let her go. Outside, the London fog thickened, swathing the estate in a grey, impenetrable shroud. The world beyond the walls vanished, leaving only the music, the shadows, and the steady, rhythmic pulse of a devotion that felt exactly like a haunting. The key in her pocket was forgotten, a relic of a past life that was being rewritten, note by note, in the suffocating gold of the afternoon. The notes of the Rachmaninoff vibrated through the marrow of her bones, each chord a heavy stone laid upon the foundation of her surrender. Elara watched her fingers dance across the ivory thin, pale ghosts flickering in the amber glow of the candelabra, and felt a strange, detached admiration for them. They no longer belonged to her. They were extensions of the instrument, and the instrument was an extension of the room, and the room was the very heart of Alistair Blackwood's ribcage. She was playing her own requiem, a threnody for the girl who had arrived at the iron gates of Blackwood Manor with mud on her boots and a frantic, starving ambition in her eyes. That girl was a smudge on a window pane, wiped clean by the silk handkerchief of his attention. Alistair did not move. He remained a statue of shadow behind her, his warmth a constant, oppressive tide against her back. He didn't need to touch her to exert his gravity. His silence was a command, his breath a tether. Elara felt the weight of the silver key in her pocket, the jagged teeth of it pressing against her thigh through the fine chiffon of her skirt. It was a cold, sharp reminder of the world beyond, the fog of the damp pavements of Highgate, the screech of the Northern Line, and the anonymity of 1,000 faces that would never look at her with the terrifying sanctity Alistair offered. In the outside world, she was a flickering candle in a gale. Here, she was a flame kept behind crystal, curated and fed, protected from the very air that would allow her to burn out. "You are hesitating at the crescendo," Alistair murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to originate from within her own chest. "You are holding back a fraction of your soul, Elara. Why are you saving it for a walk in the rain, for a life of mediocre triumphs and certain disappointments?" He leaned closer, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. The scent of him sandalwood, old leather, and the faint, metallic tang of the winter air clinging to his coat filled her senses until there was no room for her own breath. "The world outside is a graveyard of potential," he continued, his hand sliding from her shoulder to the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in the loose tendrils of her hair. "They would take your music and turn it into background noise for their tea shops and their transit. They would consume you until you were hollow. And then they would discard the shell. I am the only one who knows the cost of your silence. I am the only one who will pay it." Elara's hands faltered, a discordant note ringing out like a cry of pain. She stared at the sheet music, the black ink blurring into a web of iron bars. He was right. That was the most seductive horror of it all. He was entirely, devastatingly right. She remembered the hunger of the months before he had found her, the way her ribs had begun to map the geography of her poverty, and the way the world had looked at her as if she were a ghost haunting the banquet of the living. Alistair had reached into the fog and pulled her into the light, even if that light was a golden cage. "I feel as though I am disappearing," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the dying fire in the hearth. "No," he countered, his grip tightening ever so slightly, a possessive anchor. "You are being distilled. The dross is falling away. What remains is the essence, my essence." He reached around her, his large hand covering hers on the keys once more, guiding her into the final movement. The music surged, a dark, torrential wave of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the manor. Elara let her head fall back against his shoulder, her eyes closing. The internal battle, the frantic scratching of the bird against the bars, suddenly ceased. The exhaustion of resistance was replaced by a hollow, sweet lethargy. She thought of the gate at the end of the long, gravel drive. She thought of the key in her pocket. With a slow, deliberate movement, she shifted her weight, feeling the metal bite into her skin one last time before she let the thought of it drift away, sinking into the dark water of her psyche. The key was a useless thing now. Even if she walked to the gate, even if she turned the lock and stepped out into the London night, she would only be carrying this room with her. He had carved his name into the architecture of her mind. There was no horizon that did not feature his silhouette. The final chord echoed through the high-vaulted ceiling, a thunderous, definitive end. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, saturated with the presence of the man standing over her. Alistair reached down and picked up her right hand. Bringing it to his lips, he kissed each fingertip with a reverence that felt like a coronation and a sentencing all at once. Then his fingers dipped into the pocket of her skirt. He withdrew the silver key, holding it up between them. The moonlight, filtering through the heavy velvet curtains, caught the polished surface, making it gleam like a predator's tooth. "You found it," he said, his voice devoid of anger, replaced instead by a terrifyingly soft amusement. "I wondered how long it would take for your curiosity to outweigh your fear." Elara didn't flinch. She looked at the key, then up into his eyes vast, dark pools of absolute certainty. "I wasn't going to use it," she said, and for the first time, the words were not a lie. Alistair smiled. A slow, predatory curve of his lips, he walked over to the fireplace and, with a casual flick of his wrist, tossed the key into the glowing embers. It vanished amidst the orange heat, the silver melting, the shape of her escape dissolving into nothingness. "Good," he whispered, returning to her side. He took her face in both of his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones as if he were memorizing a map. "The threshold is gone, Elara. There is no longer a here and a there. There is only us, this house, this music, and the eternal, unchanging beauty of your devotion." He bent his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that tasted of finality. It was the taste of a door closing, of a seal being set. Elara reached up, her fingers curling into the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer. She wasn't fighting for air anymore, she was breathing his. Outside, the London fog pressed against the window panes, a thick, white shroud that erased the trees, the drive, and the distant, flickering lights of the city. The manor stood alone in a void, a solitary island of gold and shadow in an endless sea of grey. Inside, the fire crackled, the scent of melting silver hung faint in the air, and the piano stood silent, its song finished, its player finally, irrevocably home. She let her eyes close, the darkness behind her lids feeling safer than the light ever had. The boundary had been crossed, the sweetness had turned to stone, and as Alistair's arms wrapped around her, shielding her from a world she no longer recognized, Elara Vance finally stopped wondering what lay beyond the gate. The masterpiece was complete, the instrument was broken, and the music would last forever.